Hello and welcome to Resource Review here at the Science Museum in London. We're your guide to the latest and most innovative resources to assist your teaching. Today we're focusing on secondary music. Our specialist for today's show is Howard Cheeseman. Howard is Head of Music and Arts Coordinator at Coldew School in Cumbria. Howard has been a music teacher for 31 years and is an award-winning composer. Alongside Howard, we have a man with his finger on the pulse of the resources industry, Ray Barker. Ray is Director of the British Educational Suppliers Association. And finally, we have Adrian Jones, a freelance education consultant. Adrian is a former teacher, now turned resources specialist. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Howard is our secondary music expert for today. You've recommended the three resources we'll be discussing. So let's start then with Antarctic Waves. Tell us a little bit more about this resource.
Yes, this is a CD-ROM that's come from the explorations of the Antarctic survey, and it contains science and music things in it. It's in three sections. The first part is a virtual tour in which we sort of see different parts of the Antarctic and different aspects of it. The second part, which is the main music part, are 5 composing areas in which students are engaged in a variety of musical activities. And then the final part is a sort of history of the project itself.
It sounds very interesting, but before we get comments from the panel, let's see how the resource plays out in a real classroom. We visited Charles Burton and his pupils.
We've been using Antarctic Waves, which is a CD-ROM which was put out by the British Antarctic Survey in cooperation with people like Philharmonia Orchestra. And it's a resource whose aim is to inspire musical composition from school students, but at the same time introducing scientific issues in Antarctica.
See if you move one, hear the pattern changing.
So the class today were a Year 10 GCSE music class, and we were principally introducing the CD-ROM to them.
Now, when you hear this, it's quite low sounds coming, sort of drone sounds. And then put another one on a different instrument.
And just show how they might use this resource to inspire some of their future compositions. So go on, just have a minute to try and get a really short loop, which you're happy with. What I really like about this resource is that it puts music in a much wider context, so that you're thinking about Antarctica and getting inspiration from another area, which for me as a composer is very often where the best music comes from. I think if there is a problem with the resource, it's perhaps in the fact that some aspects of it are not blindingly obvious and easy to do. If I was to take one thing from this CD-ROM, it has sparked off a real interest for me in Antarctica. I'm not a scientist, never have been, but it's made me understand a little bit more about science. And now, when I hear news items about Bass's work in Antarctica, I have much more understanding than I did before, and I think that's really important.
Well, Howard, I thought that resource looked really fascinating, but is it really music?
Well, yes. In the sense that it allows pupils to get in touch with sound and articulate it and manipulate it and sequence it, I think it is.
Now, I know you've used this resource yourself with your pupils. Have you had a good reaction?
A very, very good reaction. They love the way that it actually connects up composing with something tangible like the Antarctic. That connection is a real winner.
Ray, it seems that this resource could have cross-curricular aspects to it. What are your thoughts on that?
The cross-curricular aspect is always an interesting one. I mean, it's almost flavour of the month, I think, at the minute. And what I liked about the product more than anything else was that the cross-curricular aspect came not just because it was about geography or about science, but it was about a completely alien world to me, and that's what I thought was going to be inspirational for these students.
I mean, we heard the teacher discussing the importance of setting music in context, a wider context to draw inspiration, particularly for composition. Adrienne, do you think that this resource really does that?
Well, apart from the fact that it was the most unusual resource, there was an enthusiasm on the part of the teacher that belied a real enjoyment of the resource, and also saying that, you know, he learned something himself about the science of the place.
The only thing that I wondered about really with this resource is whether it was just a little bit too quirky. Teachers might be reluctant to bring in something so different.
I think after initially getting through the first part of it, I think most teachers would feel very comfortable, especially with the additional composing tasks that are given for each of the 5 areas. They are really very imaginative, very good, and I think most teachers would welcome those, actually.
I think you can't have enough quirky resources, really. And it's not quirky in a sense of it's a negative point. And I think what we do in this country very well with ICT is we produce those very innovative products, which I like to use rather than quirky, but behind them, I mean, there are always 2 words, and that's called instructional design. And I think they're not negative comments either, because, you know, all the way behind this product there are very, very serious educational outcomes, but it's using this fantastic environment and these great ideas to be able to get those produced.
Well, thank you very much. That was obviously a very popular resource with our panel. Now let's move on to the second resource for secondary music, which is from Sound Inventors, and it's the Composition Kit 1. Howard, this is a very different resource. Tell us a little bit more about it.
Yes, we go from a high-tech resource to what seems to be a low-tech resource, and yet this composition kit is in some ways an answer to my prayers, really. The composition kit is designed for good Key Stage 3 pupils, GCSE, A-level students to use either as a discrete resource or with teacher guidance. And within it, it gives some helpful guidelines into how to start composing, how to get some simple ideas through some exercises. It then goes on to give students some composition briefs, rather like is done in GCSE and at A-level. Then an extremely helpful list of instruments and how to write for them, the ranges of the instruments and special qualities. Moving then into the idea of storyboarding for a composition, notation for composition, and then finally dealing with some frequently asked questions that composers have about the whole process.
Right, well, it sounds very diverse. Well, to explore the composition kit, we visited Mark Houghton and his class.
Today's small class being given a composition brief, which is an important component of the GCSE music course. Within the composition kit, there's a lot of relationships between words and pictures and how that relates to the music. In other words, arguably a perfect resource for that kind of task. I was focused on a little chapter called Letters, Names and Words. You look at your letters, look at the things that are there, and what it's doing is it's asking you to translate these letter names into rhythms. E we've already done, let's make that a quaver as well. The good points of the resource are it's small, it's full of information. It's there to inspire and to give ideas to students. And when you get stuck, any nudge in the right direction is very valuable. Negative points about the resource are the vocabulary that's used, the amount of print would alienate a lot of students.
The composition kit is it's like an aid to help you when you're composing music. It gives you some places you can start with and methods of ways you can find a starting point, and it also gives you guides for that particular instrument you're playing.
By handing it to the students and for them to use it in their own time and their own space, with guidance if necessary, then I think it's fantastic.
Adrian, there's a huge amount contained within this resource. Do you see it as appealing to pupils and then also to teachers?
I think it has a certain cred about it. As a teacher, I would find it, the design of it, too small. It seems very condensed.
So design-wise, you think
Design-wise, I think it leaves a lot to be desired. I think you can still give it cred, but I think the content of it is good. You know, it serves a good purpose. I just think it could have been designed a little better.
But Howard, this is a brand new resource, isn't it? What do you see as its strengths?
I think its strengths come from the fact that the tone is right, it addresses students in an intelligent but coherent manner. I also think it's everything under one roof in a booklet that you would need to know for composing. And I think that's a major strength to it.
I mean, there are lots of things coming out. I mean, the teacher said he thought the text was too difficult, he thought there was too much text, and it is an issue with its presentation, I think, isn't it? You'll say, and I think it's positive is that everything you want is in this book.
Yes.
I think it looks very professional, looking at it like that, it looks very professional. But on the other hand, if you're using it in schools, there's probably too much in one book for kids of a certain level. So, you know, you're probably talking about the higher level. If it was in a bigger format, you probably wouldn't notice the fact there were so many words to the page, and therefore you wouldn't have a difficulty in reading it. So it's a kind of challenge with those kind of products, isn't it? Because, you know, you're trying to give everybody everything they want in a particularly kind of not expensive resource. That's not a particularly expensive resource.
Now, Howard, these are very different resources. How would you compare them in helping pupils and perhaps teachers getting over that initial kind of writer's block for composition when you're faced with the blank page?
Certainly, yes. The Antarctic Waves, I think, achieves this by the science and the imaginative use of the science and the visual imagery there as an inspiration for composition. I think this gets over the sort of composer's block by giving some very, very practical advice, starting points, by saying that composing isn't something that's just appearing out of nowhere, that it's a muscle that you need to use and hone, and there are exercises that you can do in order to improve it before you go on to major composition.
Well, thank you all very much. Now let's move on to our third resource. Howard, tell us about it.
Yes, this is another answer to a different prayer. This is Coagula, which is a software synthesizer which is available as a free download. And the aim of this is to meet for us the requirement to manipulate, to refine and control sound, as in Key Stage 3 National Curriculum, which is a task which is quite difficult to do in the classroom for some of us. But using this, it's basically an image-based synthesizer. So you draw an image on the screen and then it plays back sounds relating to what you put on the screen.
For a free resource, it sounds
yes.
very in-depth, actually.
Yes.
Well, thank you all very much for some excellent discussion on three very, very diverse resources for secondary music. Just to recap, the resources that we discussed were Antarctic Waves from the British Antarctic Survey, the Composition Kit 1 from Sound Inventors, and then lastly, Coagula. For more information on all of the resources mentioned here today and to post your own comments about resources for secondary music, you can visit our website, that's teachers.tv/resource review, or if you like, you can email us, that's resourcereview@teachers.tv. Many thanks to our panellists for today, to Howard, to Adrienne and to Ray. Thank you very much for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Resource Review. Bye-bye.